Today I want to speak about another anti-nautch or anti-devadasi or anti-dance or anti-temple dance and temple dancer activist, this time a woman from the West, from the United States, a woman called Jenny Fuller, who wrote the book The Wrongs of Indian Womanhood, which was published in 1900, the year of her death. She died in India of cholera in the course of her missionary duties, and I suppose it's only decent to acknowledge that. She was therefore a woman who had the courage of her convictions. She died in the course of her labors for her Indian Christian flock. She published the book under the name Mrs. Marcus B. Fuller because that was customary at the time. It was considered incorrect for a woman to publish a book under her own name, and so she used her husband's name, Marcus B., which is an irony, considering that it is a recognition of the subordination of women to men, which is one of her gripes about the treatment of women in India. However, it's a small irony when compared to the horrors that she describes that were confronted by women and girls in India in the 1890s, the time when she was mainly at her post as a missionary in Bombay and the surrounding regions. Jenny Fuller has a gripe about India itself that colors the whole of her notion about all the perceived evils that women suffered in India. And her book does not deal only with the question of the dancer, the devadasi, or the nautch girl only. It deals also with topics that were current in the missionary mind at that time, including such things as infanticide, childhood marriage, the disposal of many child widows, and a whole array of other suppressive and oppressive measures to which Indian women were subjected at the time. And Mrs. Fuller's gripe is really against the religions in India that enable this state of affairs. So for her, she says quite plainly, the reason for these problems, these dire problems under which women labor in India, is the religions. She tells us quite clearly that Hinduism is the religion that is the chief reason for the complete absence of women's rights in India, and that Mohammedanism, to use her language, is another. Her idea then is that the real salvation for India and for the women of India is that the country be Christianized. So this underlying philosophy colors her whole book. Now, when we come to the section on the nautch girl, there are some interesting elements that emerge. One of them being a factor that still plagues the scene today when historians attempt to make sense of what was going on there, and that is the confusion between different types of so-called devadasi systems in India. Mrs. Fuller does make distinctions between the dances of Central, North India, and so on, the Tabaif tradition, the Kota tradition, the Proto-Katak world, and the courtesan atmosphere in that world, and then the temple dances of South India, which she recognizes belong to a different system, an evil system that is kept in place by Hinduism. And she makes other distinctions, finer discriminations between the various types of women and girls that were in temple service one way or another, although she binds them all to the factor of dance, singing and dancing for the idol, which in her view is very bad. Now, when it comes to what exactly it is about the system that she does not like and would like to see eradicated, Mrs. Fuller is rather unclear. One understands from the tone of her writing that she was a woman with a delicate mind. She did not want to offend anyone's sensibilities by using words that were too explicit, such as, for example, prostitute. So she speaks about the dancers and women in temple service as public women sometimes, but she also uh, accuses them of immorality in a general sort of way. We are left in the dark about exactly what she means, although the insinuation is constant that the kind of immorality of which they are guilty is a sexual immorality. She shows herself conversant with such differences between the functionaries, Devadasi functionaries in the temple systems throughout South India. She also mentions the temple system at Pune, where the Muralis are, and she uh, uh, makes the distinction between them, and yet we don't find that the distinctions that she makes are in any way really helpful for sorting out what exactly was going on in that milieu at that time. For example, speaking of the temple dancers in Pune, she says only that as a mere girl, she makes her debut in dancing in the community by the observation of a shocking custom, which is in itself enough to condemn the whole system. But she does not pause to tell us what that shocking custom is. And having looked quite closely at her book, I find no other allusion to it or any sort of explanation for it. And she also feels upset at the fact that the temple girls, because they have been taught reading and writing, are a cause for parents in the higher classes not wanting their kids to study reading and writing because the ability to become literate has been tainted by the debased Devadasi community, somehow tainted. So Nautch girls prevent other girls from being educated. That's one of her gripes. And another is that they dance in public. You know, we have seen with our own eyes that dancing girls were the only female participants in a social function, detrimental to the cause of morality, and they are given huge gifts. Now, this kind of thing hardly qualifies as uh, as a kind of immorality that she implies constantly beneath the surface. She also has gripes about government officials and uh, administrators and so on attending the dances because she feels that they set a bad example. And she takes the colonial government to task for not acting on the advice of the various social reform groups that were then active in India. She is quite aware of them, and she demonstrates that there is a great sympathy between the Christian missionaries set up in India at the time and the Hindu reformers who had come from the time really of Ram Mohan Roy in Calcutta and were making slow progress in improving the lot of women in India. She shows a sympathy for them. But when it comes to the dancing girl, she remains, although she's quite verbose, I mean, she attempts to make a refined and detailed analysis of the various types, but she's more confusing than enlightening when she undertakes that task. And as I've just said, she gives us no evidence of anything other than that the dancing girls were sexually not as decent as Christianity would expect them to be. For example, she accuses them of singing filthy songs in the presence of the idols. And she says that she got hold of a book that contained these songs, and she was totally shocked by what she read there. So we see again in the case of Mrs. Fuller that the reaction is one of her time. She's also shocked, for example, at the erotic, she thinks of them as obscene sculptures that adorn Hindu temples, and she's surprised that these sculptures are allowed to be photographed and distributed, and that other people who have not seen this are confronted with these obscenities. So for her, really, the approach to the dancing girl is a way of getting at Hinduism itself. It's not that she's trying to suggest that there could be some kind of reform within the system that would make it less exploitative of women. She is really saying that the Devadasi system is one element of the much larger evil of Hinduism in India. Now, she does not recognize that there are different kinds of moralities in different parts of the world. She recognizes that there is one morality for everyone, and that morality is the Christian morality. She makes that quite clear. And it is clear throughout her book that she dearly hopes for the Christianization of the entire subcontinent, because outside of Christianization, when all is said and done, the situation of women in general and of the Nautch girl in particular is never going to change. Of the South Indian Devadasis, she says that there were 11,573 of them in South India in 1881, and it's a figure that horrifies her. And she speaks in general terms of the temple service as a debasing custom. They are invariably, she says, courtesans, sanctioned by religion and society, the common property of the priests. Now, what she means by the common property of the priests is again vague. One must assume that it's her delicate way of saying that the priests were regularly sexually abusing the Devadasis, and that was really at the heart of the system. In a sense, for her, to her mind, the Devadasis are really so far from being valid parts, valid ritual specialists in the temple services of Hinduism in India at the time. They were really just smuggled in under cover of the ritual tasks and the dance and the music, smuggled in under the cover of those religious duties in order to act as the common property of the priests, and also, by the way, of men who come to the temple, because men ostensibly come to the temple to worship, but actually, she says, they come there to see the dancing girls. Men go to the temple actually to see her, and then they're ruined by her, because she speaks of men falling under their power. They have the power to make men fall into utter ruin. So this then is really the sum total of her take. For all the closeness that she attempts in analysis, and for all the discernment and differentiation that she makes, the essence of her complaint against the Devadasi is that they lure men to their ruin. And again, she attributes this ailment, this evil, to Hinduism itself. She tells us that Radha is not Krishna's wife, but his mistress. And this is the kind of example that the gods of Hinduism set for the public, and therefore it's a free-for-all, a sexual free-for-all when it comes to the Devadasis. Although at some point she also slips in the form of just 3 or 4 words, that the Devadasis are actually from the marital point of view or the conjugal point of view, are actually associated only with one man. So again, that is a difficult point to ascertain in the context of everything she writes, because it's contradictory, and she confines herself to saying that some of them are in relationships with one man for years. The rest, however, are held in a system which makes her marvel, I'm quoting her, at the long suffering of God as he daily beholds this modern Sodom. So there isn't really much we can say about Mrs. Fuller's anti-nautch writings that differentiates her largely from other Christian missionaries and radical commentators writing about the Devadasi at the time. What she does achieve is a bit of a fog in which we are left wondering how the system really was then, because when she claims to be quoting experts, it's usually people that she knows personally that have told her that it is so and so and so, and she just believes that and uses that as a basis for further generalization. Uh, Now, there is one interesting element to her writing that is not usually touched on by historians dealing with the anti-nautch movement and the troubles that the Devadasi system went through in the period, let's say, from 1890 to 1920. And this is uh, Mrs. Fuller's deep antipathy towards Annie Besant, because Mrs. Fuller also has a section on, in her book, she has a section on the reasons as she sees it, why the anti-nautch movement is not making much progress. One of the complaints is one that's also typical of the time, which is that government officials are really not much interested in legislating or taking any kind of action against the Devadasi system. The other is that Hindu reformers themselves are often hypocrites. While they write and speak in public about reforming the system, they themselves marry child brides and put those child brides in danger of becoming child widows. And so she says, or implies rather, that it is very difficult for Hindu reformers to live by what they preach because the system is too strong. And uh, one of her gripes against Annie Besant is that Annie Besant, instead of working to Christianize India, is actually advocating Hinduism as a religion that is superior to Christianity and is holding the West up as a model of materialist corruption, which is in need of taking lessons, philosophical lessons, and societal lessons from the Hindu system. She's very angry at Mrs. Besant for, or Annie Besant for that activity. And she mentions that some Hindu reformers were also uh, unhappy with Annie Besant because they could not get her to commit to any of the reform movements or any of the reform agendas that they had embraced, among them the abolition of the Devadasi system. They sent her some questions. I mean, they sent some questions to Annie Besant, which they wanted answered. And among those was the question whether she found it desirable that a class of women called dancing girls, who are invariably prostitutes, should be given a status in the Hindu temples during worship and in Hindu homes on festive occasions as singers or dancers. This is a question that Annie Besant flatly refused to answer. And this is of interest because many commentators on the anti-nautch movement seem to give the prime spot to the Theosophical Society as having been the major destroyer of the Devadasi system, whereas here we see a rather different dynamic playing out between Mrs. Fuller and Annie Besant. I thought I would just mention that because it's actually an interesting point to look into more closely. What we learn on the whole from the writing of Mrs. Marcus B. Fuller is in fact nothing new. And this is the case with other missionary writers, also women of her time, of the 3 or 4 years during which she was writing her own uh, 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 essays on social reform in India, which were actually published in the Bombay Guardian, a Christian newspaper, between roughly 1898 and 1900, the year of her death from cholera. And the other two interesting books from the period are written by Caroline Atwater Mason and by Mrs. Moses Smith, another case of a woman not being allowed to use her own name when publishing a book. And these books are Lux Christi, an outline study of India, A Twilight Land, by Caroline Atwater Mason, published in 1902, and Women Under the Ethnic Religions, published in 1898, by Mrs. Moses Smith. The reason I mention them is because, in substance, they very much resemble Jenny Fuller's own writing. In other words, there was a narrative current at the time that belonged to the whole Christian perspective on the Devadasi, and it was largely a narrative that had been inherited by hearsay across the whole 19th century, usually, no, always, completely lacking in any sort of detail or evidence as regards the immoral lifestyle of the dancers, and vague when it comes to pinning down what exactly it is about the dance that they would like to see reformed. But, of course, they don't want to see the dance reformed. They want to see it completely obliterated. And as I said in my previous talk about Mr. Naidu, the dance for these reformers, both Western and Indian, was not the thing in itself. It was not das Ding an sich. It was not the real evil that they wanted to root out. It was an art that rode on the fine line between what they considered moral and what they considered immoral, and was therefore, in their minds, the gateway to all the rest of the evils. So one somehow has the idea that what they really felt beneath the words that they wrote and spoke about the dance was that if they could shut that gateway to the rest of the evils in Indian society as they perceived them, the gateway to sexual immorality would be shut if the dancer was excluded from society, and all of the evils of the sexual exploitation of women and girls would somehow magically disappear when the nautch was brought to an end. This seems to me to be the way they actually saw the problem. And of course, then in the case of Christians, uh, the, the problem was really rooted in Hindu tradition, Hindu religion, Hindu philosophy, the way the Hindu customs saw society and treated women in that society. And their agenda was certainly not to see a reformed form of Hinduism, but to see Hinduism done away with entirely.